It still counts. But yeah, wrangling's more important. Okay, we're going to begin this session with a short video. So if we'd like to play the video now to kind of bring us into the topic.
The world is in the middle of an accelerating nature crisis.
Crisis.
Reaffirms our commitment.
Commitment
to adopt an ambitious global
Biodiversity Framework.
nature-based solutions.
to stop financing the destruction of nature. 30% of land and ocean globally.
On nature, forests and oceans.
And 1 million animal species.
Reverse nature loss, pollution, habitat destruction.
Thank you. Great. Thanks, everybody, for making it on Monday morning here at the Palais de Congrès. My name's Gavin Edwards. I'm the Global Director for the Nature Positive Initiative at WWF International, and I'll be moderating the panel today. The topic of the panel is implementation. It is about tracking action. So hopefully, in the next few days, we will actually start to see a consensus emerge with 0 brackets in the negotiating text, and included in that text a set of action targets, more than 20 action targets, that will need to be tracked over the next decade. We know some of the challenges with the Aichi targets and implementation. Some of it was about lack of resource mobilization. Some of it was a lack of kind of tracking on a very, very regular basis, and sometimes there was a lack of independent tracking as well. However, there were efforts to track. We need to learn from the past decade of tracking efforts as well, and how we can apply that to the next decade. And of course, while some of the Aichi targets were partially implemented, we all know that we need to do much, much better in the next decade. Fortunately, there's a really good conversation here going on in the negotiating text about implementation, about the idea of a ratchet, the idea that governments can come together and ratchet up action every so often with a stock take. That'll, of course, depends upon very clear targets and an ability to measure those targets as well. So we're going to be exploring this from a number of different dimensions today with a really interesting panel from a handful of different perspectives. I'm going to introduce the panel members one by one and ask them to share a few thoughts. And then we should have about 10 or 15 minutes at the end for questions. So do please think of some kind of testing questions for the panel as well, and we're looking forward to some interaction too. First of all, I would like to introduce Ana de Valença. Ana is the Agri-Food Project Manager with Metabolic Consultants in the Netherlands, a consultancy that WWF has been working with the last couple of years around this question of tracking. And Ana, I have a question to get you started. So can you outline the main considerations in monitoring and the experience you have in building a proof of concept for tracking both actions and outcomes? Over to you.
Is this working? Yes. Thank you, Gavin. Yeah, to answer that question, I put together a couple of slides for you. Just to repeat, I work at Metabolic Consulting, and we provide advice on a myriad of questions on how to transition to a more sustainable economy. And this summer, I worked with Gavin at WWF on the Nature Action Tracker to conceptualize how we can indeed measure, track what actions countries are already taking for nature to achieve the Global Biodiversity Framework action targets, and also how we can track their outcomes. Just to say, we worked on this also together with Arboretica, a data and computer science company, and also with some other organizations that are already involved in tracking or interested in it, and some of them are here in the panel today. Next slide. Just a little bit on the why a nature action tracker. WWF identified a need for a holistic, independent tracker of actions and outcomes, and this is partly inspired by the Climate Action Tracker. I don't know if you know it, but I'll show in the next slide what that is about. And the aim is really to understand what countries, so national governments, are already doing in terms of actions, and whether their outcomes are sufficient in order to achieve the agreed targets. So the aim is really to promote accountability and transparency and encourage ambition. That's one of the main aims, to encourage ambition and inspire across countries how to achieve the targets. Yeah, and just a note, it will be a public website, it should be a public-facing tool with insights for policy influencers. And this is an example of how the Climate Action Tracker looks like, just to give you an idea behind this sort of conceptual thinking. It's an amazing resource where over 40 countries have a profile where the Climate Institute and others identified what they're doing in terms of climate action and whether it's enough to achieve the agreed goals and their fair share in the 1.5 targets. And it's an amazing resource where you can also see how they came to that in conclusion and see many details behind. Well, here we see, for example, that Canada is highly insufficient in achieving their climate goals. Well, a bit more on the conceptual framework behind tracking action and outcomes. It basically has 4 pillars, and this summer we focused on the 2 highlighted pillars. But if you would do the full stack of tracking, it starts with checking commitments. What kind of commitments did national governments agree to? Conventions, partnerships, etc., the Global Biodiversity Framework. And then look at policies on national level. What actual policies, legislations, action plans do countries have in place to address those commitments, to take action on those? And here we identified that it's really important to not only look at the policy documents, but also involve key informants, in-country experts who know the social political context of those policies and know, can provide information on how to interpret them, which ones are the most important, etc. Then ideally you would track implementation. So it's great to have policies in place and beautiful words on paper, but if you want to track action, you have to know whether and how those policies are being implemented underground. Also, their in-country expertise is essential. And lastly, linking those with actual outcomes for nature. And we explored the methodology to track the state of nature with key performance indicators. For example, the Red List Species Index could be an amazing indicator. But there's also some work to do to develop a way to link really those policies with those outcomes and to have to show the direct link. Anyway, some conclusions from the what we call proof of concept we worked on over the summer is that this kind of nature action tracking is challenging, but should be doable with the right amount of data, resources, and people in place. And it's key now to invest in more research, develop that methodology further, and establish a governance structure to start implementing it. And then there are some questions which might be interesting as conversation starters also here on, for example, how to account for temporal lags between actions and outcomes, because you can take an action for nature now, today, but maybe see only the results of that in 10 years with restored nature. So how do you take that into account in your tracker activities, as well as how to take the fair share of countries into account, whether that's agreed in these negotiations or not? How to assess the likelihood of policy delivery, so that implementation question, and a more practical question, maybe what geographical scope and time frame to start with. So that's just some context on hopefully raising your, answering your question, and yeah, maybe we can discuss some of these things later today.
Thank you, Anna. Yeah, I think we'll come back to some of those challenging questions towards the end in the panel discussion. But next, let's hear from Barbara Engels. Barbara is the head of department for international nature conservation of the German Federal Agency for Nature Conservation. Barbara, how important will monitoring of implementation be for your government and also at the European level as well?
Yeah, thank you very much. Monitoring and tracking what is happening in terms of action and achievements is important. It has always been important. And let me illustrate that with an example from my own country. Germany has its national biodiversity strategy in place since 2007, with some revision in 2015. And this national strategy is accompanied by a set of what we call the National Biodiversity Strategy indicators, which have been developed based on national monitoring availabilities to monitor directly some of the targets, or the most important targets and fields of action in our national strategy. So for us, this has always been important, and no surprise, monitoring, and especially getting agreed a monitoring framework here at COP together with the Global Biodiversity Framework is something which is important to Germany and to the EU. And we really think it's only if you can measure change that you really can measure what is happening. And measuring change and having a monitoring framework with indicators in place is really important. And I keep on saying in some of the negotiations here, don't be afraid of indicators. At first, an indicator is a very neutral thing. It measures change over time. And change can be positive, change can be negative, and whether change is enough or not is some kind of political assessment afterwards. But the indicator is a neutral thing. So I hope it should be not too difficult to agree on indicators if we put that at the forefront. And secondly, indicators are important. The measuring of the progress is important also on a national, be it national, EU or global level, to really direct the resource and the attention to the fields of action where we are not doing sufficient or not doing enough. And I know how it works on a national level. You really have to have a proof and have to show this is a field of action where we have to be more active. This is what the data shows us. So this is where we have to move on. Or even if we are doing good, saying what we have been doing has been the right thing, you can see that with the progress being measured. So let's keep on doing good things. So for triggering the necessary resources, monitoring is equally important. And last but not least, indicators are super important for communication. Because if you can measure something with a value, you can communicate about it. And I think for all these reasons, we are really aware of how important it is to get the monitoring framework adopted here, and we're doing our best. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Barbara. And next, we're going to move on to Natasha Ali, who's the head of department head of department for Senior Program Officer for UNEP, World Conservation Monitoring Center. I may have given you a promotion there, but UNEP WCMC has played a key role in the last decade or more in helping and supporting parties in all sorts of ways, and will play a central role in the implementation of the Global Biodiversity Framework. So in that case, Natasha, I'd really like to hear, how does UNEP WCMC plan to help meet the needs of parties in monitoring and implementation? And we have some slides for Natasha as well.
Thanks so much, Gavin. So is this working? Thanks very much, Gavin. So the first thing is, as you've mentioned, UNEP WCMC plays a role in providing information to parties exactly on what Barbara's mentioned. So we've provided information about the indicators that are proposed in the monitoring framework for the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. We maintain various information resources, and we make these available in various ways. So we've got a couple of websites that you can consult to see about what's happening about the indicators. We have a similar target tracking website that we will adopt once the headline indicators are adopted here at COP15. So it will help countries with tracking progress at that level. But the main support that we're providing to countries is on their development of national monitoring systems. So we'll be reaching out through the GEF7 early action support to countries early in January to assess countries' ability to use the monitoring framework and to access the indicators, to provide training and capacity support to countries in adoption of those indicators at the national scale. And as Barbara mentioned, you know, some countries have great capacity and they're already using many indicators at the national level, but that's very different across the globe. So what we want to do is identify those capacity needs for countries and then assist them in the access to the information that they require, and develop that national capacity to collate data, to use data, and to help ratchet up, as Gavin mentioned, ratchet up actions to implement the post-2020 framework. The other thing that Barbara mentioned was on the selection of those indicators. You know, although it should be a neutral process, it isn't. And partly the reason it isn't is because some of the indicators have varying amounts of information for some of the countries. So you can't necessarily disaggregate all of the information at the global scale to the national scale easily for some indicators. And that's a problem for many countries. So what we want to do is support countries in accessing that information and also understanding the scope of those indicators. On the slides here, I'm going to talk about something else we're doing, which relates to how Anne and I can work together. So we're hearing all the time that countries are reaching out for support on the implementation of the post-2020 framework. And this enhanced transparency that's coming through the discussions, the need for enhanced transparency, is something we're really mindful of at UNEP. So what we want to do is support countries in that transparency of information. And we're also mindful that everybody we speak to here at COP15 is trying to develop a tool that will help countries in that monitoring of implementation of the actions that they're taking. So we've been doing a scoping assessment at UNEP WCMC and the European Commission around a global knowledge support service for biodiversity, which would bring together the necessary tools that countries could use to monitor implementation at the national scale. And more than just the tools, the Global Knowledge Service would also provide access to networks such as the Biodiversity Indicators Partnership and other scientific networks across the globe to provide support to countries as required. And it would also provide an overview of some of the resources and tools that we've mentioned here. I'm not sure what's going on behind me on the screen because I can't see it. But essentially that system would provide a federated, non-biased platform, essentially, of information that countries could use subject to their requirements, and also access to the relevant networks, as I mentioned. So that's a snapshot of what WCMC is doing. Thanks.
Great. Thanks so much, Natasha. And next we're going to move on to Cecil Haverkamp. He's the director of the Food, Environment, Land and Development Action Tracker and program with the Food Land team at UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network. Cecil, quick question for you. Describe your experience with FELD and what we might learn from your work with FELD for the wider challenge of action tracking for nature.
Thank you. Thank you, Gavin, for having me as well on this panel. For those of you who don't know UN SDSN, we're a UN-affiliated network of research and university organizations worldwide. And we've been reporting and monitoring progress on the SDGs more broadly since the SDGs came about. And so our experience around SDG reporting has led us to look beyond kind of the official data and the UN access to data as reported by governments. And in that context, we're also asked to put together an action tracker for food and land use. We're a core partner of the Food and Land Use Coalition, and this idea of tracking action on food and land use was very important to the Food and Land Use Coalition, especially with a focus on what actually happens on the ground in terms of implementation. So we started with the FELD action tracker. It's a bit of a mouthful, but just to explain, food, environment, land, and development. The idea behind this is to avoid a fragmentation of having action trackers for every little area. But we're very keen and very happy to help a nature action tracker come about, because it's really the biggest piece missing, I would say, today. And referred to the climate action tracker that has, over the past 15, 20 years, been very successful, has been clearly the one place to go to for media and for governments to see how are we doing, quote unquote, on climate. And we need to be able to do something similar for nature, especially given the track record of, if I can say this as a newcomer to CBD, the track record of previous frameworks, where I would say the equivalent of standing with a stopwatch at the finish line and just to say we failed cannot be good enough anymore in the future. And we really need something that is much more closely watching. So our experience with FELD has been to see how we can go beyond kind of official data and really to look at kind of policy indicators and proxy indicators for what governments are doing. And I would say maybe just to add on to the rationale that was provided already for tracking, and I can say yesterday, for example, when talking to people, people intrinsically buy into the idea of action tracking and say it's the whole point of having targets is that you track targets. But when the question is how do you do it and who is going to do it, the questions kind of divide. So I think it's really important to understand also that we're talking about really complex issues, and we really don't know. No country can and should develop this on its own. There's a lot to learn. We need policy learning, we need shared learning, and we need to really understand what kind of policy measures work in what kind of context to accelerate the learning curve. We cannot have each country kind of figure out on their own how they can achieve this. And so this idea is also, I think, acknowledged in various UN documents that calls for transparency and to really an opportunity to learn across countries and sectors. And that's what we're trying with the FELD Action Tracker, where we, for example, have looked at national determined contributions as a way of identifying, as Anne put it on that little spectrum, what are the commitments, and then to see, okay, based on those commitments, what are the associated policy measures? What is government doing in different constituencies to implement? As everyone knows with country experience, is if it doesn't show up in the budgets, if it doesn't show up on people's responsibilities, if there's no one, say, on Monday morning coming to the office feeling this is my job to push this forward, then probably it's not happening. And so the idea is not to replace official reporting or the work of UNEP or others who are officially mandated to do that. It's really about complementing kind of this type of reporting and monitoring with a much more focused and critical look at policy. And maybe if I can end on a provocation, is really to say this is not something that can be done from 10,000-mile altitude in terms of people, smart people at global level looking across countries and to say, oh, this policy is being implemented and this one is not. It really requires us to find a way to tap into that rich local knowledge, lots of researchers in countries who really understand what the current, including government, of course, to see what is the current state of policies and what's the experience with those policies. Do they achieve what is meant to be achieved? And to really see how that lesson, how that learning can benefit broader progress, so that 10 years from now, we're not again there where we are now, that we say we failed all the targets or most of the targets, and could we have done better? So I think really this is the time to raise the stakes and to really make sure that action tracking is part of the process of ensuring that action will happen.
Great. Thanks, Cecil. Now, last on the panel is Mark Goff. Mark is the Executive Director of the Capitals Coalition. And Mark, we heard from
I'm the CEO, actually. But
CEO, okay. Chief Executive Officer of the Capitals Coalition.
You can't promote and then demote me. That's not fair.
Thank you, Mark. as we heard from Anna earlier, there's a kind of a continuum from commitment all the way through to outcome. And before outcome, we need to see implementation as well. So my question to you, Mark, is how can we actually look at the work that you do, for example, on natural capital assessments and financial flows, and use that as a marker for implementation? Where's the nexus between your work and implementation from a monitoring perspective?
Thank you, Gavin. So the first thing I'd say is that there's a very, very high risk of that the implementation mechanism here is not going to be decided in the negotiations, and it's going to be pushed back to later COPs. So the first thing is we need to get that agreed. So if you're talking to anyone involved in the negotiations, please go in and start encouraging them that we need to get an agreement here on that. It's not because the countries don't want to agree with it, it's about the resourcing of it and those normal issues. So that's the first thing, we need that in place first. On natural capital, the idea of that, Target 14 in the Global Biodiversity Framework at the moment is actually calling for the national level accounting, natural capital accounting. So measuring those stocks and resources that create flows of benefits. They're actually calling for that. We've already got over 80 different countries that are already doing that work. The US signed up this April. I think we started conversations with them 7 years ago, so it takes some time to get things in place. But that United Nations system of environmental economic accounts already provides a very good baseline of the stock of resources that we've got there and the changes that happen within that. So that needs to be brought in there. Why is this idea of value so important? I think you mentioned this earlier on, is that if we just measure things and we know there's 1,000 or 1 trillion trees, that doesn't actually mean anything. What we need to do is know what those trees, are they the right trees, are they in the right place, what's the connection to local people, and that's where the natural capital bit comes in. It helps us to understand the value of these things that we're measuring. It's only when we understand that value that we can actually start making decisions and informing decisions with that information. If we've just got the metrics, i.e. 1 trillion trees, that actually doesn't mean very much to anyone. So we could measure that we've had 1,000 trees, we've now got 1 trillion, but that may not be solving the problem, because are they the right trees, are they in the right place, etc. like that. I think the other point I'd just like to make is around the digitalization. In financial data, we've been adding in digitalization to financial data only in the last 15, 20 years. Now, that's great, but we've been retrospectively putting that in. We've got the opportunity here to make sure that digitalization is at the heart of this. So we've just taken on hosting the digitalization of sustainability data, a lab that we're setting up with the EDM Council, which regulates this sort of work with a lot of the major players there. And what we need to start thinking about with all of these frameworks and tracking is how we're actually tagging that data and able to put it through. So yes, I am talking about blockchain and the cryptocurrencies and things like that, but there's an awful lot of work going on in that and the nature tech space. So whereas before, several years ago, when I was trying to get soil sampling done on agricultural land, I'd have to go in there and do certain things. Now with environmental DNA testing, I can do it very cheaply and very quickly, and that information can help us to get exact data very on time. So those sort of nature tech solutions are going to be a big part of this as well. So we must make sure that we're building that in to the tracking systems that we've got as we're going along.
Thank you, Mark. Brilliant. Okay, so I'm just going to fire a couple of questions in now, and if people do have questions, we'll open up the floor as well. If you look closely at our panelists, there's a range of footwear on display here. Some of it's suitable for the field, some of it's suitable for tracking from a global perspective from behind a desk as well. And so this leads me to my question for any of the panelists around global perspectives on tracking versus local. One of the big challenges on nature is unique and different everywhere in the world. CO2, and we heard the climate action tracker earlier. There are challenges there, but there's a bit more comparability. So I'm interested in the tension between the global and the local, and if anybody can speak to how to bridge that and the importance of both, but the importance for it to add up to some kind of a tracking that can drive policy as well. Would anyone like to speak to this global-local challenge? Natasha, please.
Okay, first of all, I don't always wear these shoes. I think that the main thing that I wanted to bring to this question is, and I'll come back to the final point that I want to make at the end of this, is that what we had with the Aichi targets was an indicative list of indicators that were mainly at the global scale and that countries could use at their discretion, but it was mainly used for things like global reports, like the Global Biodiversity Framework. And in fact, NatureServe undertook an assessment of the globally agreed indicators in that indicative list and found that a very small percentage of countries were using those indicators. So the whole point of bringing in a monitoring framework into the discussions as the goals and targets are being discussed for the post-2020 framework was to avoid that, repeating that mistake, to allow countries to have that access to a set of indicators that we can all agree that we will use for national reporting. So we've seen a real shift from top-down global measures to national measures. And then the next step down that you're describing, Gavin, to local action, I think needs to be coordinated at the national scale through national monitoring systems. So countries will establish, in response to the post-2020 framework, a means to implement actions on the ground. And those actions can be coordinated and monitored through national monitoring systems. And those national monitoring systems can rely on whatever sources they feel is appropriate for the national scale. So they might just use national institutions, mandated institutions to collect data, and they might rely on UN statistics agencies and national statistic offices to collate that information, as we do for the Sustainable Development Goals. But they might also use, and they're going to have to use, frankly, other types of data from non-state actors, universities, academia, scientific organisations, conservation organisations, indigenous and local communities, a range of different, and from across different sectors. And so and that is the decision at the national scale as to how to collect that data and how to use that data and how to verify that data. And there's a challenge there in terms of the verification of the data. So there are some issues there to grapple with, but I think they should be grappled with at the national scale, and global agencies can support those national considerations, but I think it's for countries to decide. The final point I want to make, and I'm going to bring it in here if you don't mind, is that we're talking about tracking here, and it's really important, but my main concern when we're talking like this is that we're trying to support implementation. So monitoring, although I lead monitoring at WCMC, monitoring I don't think should detract from implementation. It's there to support, but it should not detract from implementation. Thanks.
Great. Thanks. We'll go to Barbara next on the question, and then Mark.
Yeah, thank you. And going directly back to what Natasha said, yes, it's on the national level. And I think what is important is then when countries are requested to update their national biodiversity strategies, there is the link to these indicators also on a national level directly into this reporting, into this not only in the reporting but in the national strategies themselves. So decide, when you set up your national targets, decide directly on an indicator, or or choose from a list of indicators which are there, and this is what is the beauty, I would call, in the monitoring framework, that it has a list of complementary and component indicators where countries can look to and see, okay, this is an indicator which has been suggested for this and this global target. I'm setting up my national target, so here's a list. So can I get inspired by this list, choose from this list, and also then, by the same time, if many countries choose the same indicator for reporting on some national targets, we collectively add to the global data and the global tracking. I think that's the beauty of it. And as Natasha said, there is a big need in terms of capacities, not only to be able to set up the strategy, but also to be able to choose the right indicator and then in the end have a monitoring system which is able to feed into these reporting. But it is all in the, and you were mentioning the implementation of the GBF. This is already settled there. It's in what is planned. And the discussions on this have started here in a very positive way, I would like to say. So it's really, I think people are aware that there's a direct link from the national from the global to the national, and then also to the local. And there's also been a wide acceptance that for the monitoring, for collecting data, for having information, that citizen science, indigenous knowledge plays a crucial role in that. I think there's a wide acceptance on that here. So I'm positive on that account.
Thanks, Barbara. Mark?
To move from monitoring to implementation also, we can't just take a list of indicators and choose the ones you like. It's got to be around where the biggest impact that's happening. So that's where it's got to be local, and you were right, nature is also very local. That's also where the whole idea of this natural capital evaluation helps, because that puts that into a structured way to identify what it is. So you kind of have to do that assessment before you can choose the indicators. You can't just go down a list and say, well, I'll do water because water's on the list. You've got to understand where the impact is to be able to come back to then choose them. So it's an iterative process. I think the other thing on that list, Natasha, that you were mentioning there, you didn't mention business as being part of it. I'd add them in as well. We've got a biggest business delegation we've ever seen at a COP here. And I think that actually there's a lot of work that they're doing, a lot of information they've got. And once again, it's making sure that we're sharing that from some of the business investments going on with the government. And a lot of that is about the actual, there's information there, but we're not sharing it between them. So there's a big piece to play there as well.
Thanks, Mark.
I know you did, yeah. I just wanted to make sure that was in there.
And a follow-up question from me, and then we'll take some questions from the audience. A question regarding tracking in general. When I've been involved in this space in the last year or two, and I ask people, where is the global tracking? The first answer I get is, that person's tracking, that person's tracking. There's an awful lot of data out there. There's never been more information than today about the state of outcomes for nature and also tracking of policies of governments. But somehow it's not adding up. So the response I tend to get is tracking is very necessary, whether it's independent tracking, as Anna sketched out, or tracking for and in support of partisan implementation that Barbara and Natasha sketched out as well. So it's there. But the question, the follow-up question I always get, or I ask, and I never get quite the clear answer to, is it possible? And possible is not a binary answer, because there are degrees of tracking that you need to do to actually drive further action as well. We heard from you, Anna, earlier that you think it's possible at a certain level. But I'd like one or two panel members to focus on the question of how possible is it to provide independent tracking and tracking for parties in a way that will drive further action and implementation. Cecil.
Thank you. And it's really the core question of how to track. For us, it was quite clear from the beginning as the FELD Action Tracker that we're not going to do kind of a name and shame type of tracking where you have these typical traffic light rankings of red and orange and green. In certain sectors, there's a purpose for that, and it might be useful. But for us, and I would assume it's similar for nature as a broad area, there's so much learning that needs to happen that it's better to focus really on the learning part and to see how can we provide the assessments that we're doing as inputs for governments and others to really learn from what is working and from what is not. So I think one can calibrate a tracker on the spectrum between, is it a kind of a learning, more leaning toward the learning or more leaning to the naming and shaming? And I think that's really also important for another reason, and that is the complexity that I mentioned before, is governments, and especially governments that come newly into office, they often share with us this frustration that for years afterwards they're bashed for the results of the policies of their predecessors. And they feel, what's the point of us trying really ambitious new policies if it's not reflected by you guys? Now, I'm not sure to what extent a proper tracker will in itself be a motivating factor, but it's clear that we also have to avoid the opposite, that there is a disincentive for governments to take meaningful action. And I think it's really by a tracker that is focused on learning, policy learning, but also a tracker that can highlight champions, that can really identify good practices and say, you know, to really acknowledge that lots of governments want to do the right thing, but they just don't know how to do it. This is complex stuff. And there's a real genuine demand for what are the lessons from this type of policy measure versus another policy measure, fully knowing that countries are different and that things need to be contextualized, but it still helps a lot for governments to have this resource to draw from to say, it seems like lots of countries in similar situations like ours have good experiences with, you know, carbon budgets, with all kinds of different tools, and to see how a tracker cannot just, and in that sense, it's quite different from monitoring indicators. It really is meant to be a more qualitative assessment of what are countries doing, what seems to be working in different contexts, and what can really accelerate action going forward. And maybe the final word, if we might have had lots of trackers in the past, but we didn't have accountability. And that's a real failure, I think, of us together, is that, again, coming years later and saying what we've tried to do was insufficient is not helping. We need a much shorter kind of feedback loop that can really make sure that we have policies that are effective. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Cecil. Anna, please.
Hello. I totally agree with Cecil, and also on the fact that this establishing a new independent tracker should really be not only to track what's going on, but also to inspire better implementation, more ambition, etc. And I just wanted to add on the question whether it's possible. Over the summer, when exploring methodologies to do this nature action and outcome tracking, we realized that the climate action tracker is an amazing example, but they took 10 years to establish that one, and it's only climate. And climate is just one of the over 20 action targets within the Global Biodiversity Framework. So tracking nature is very complex. We need to track pollution, we need to track sustainable agriculture, the amount of restored and conserved land, etc. So it's very diverse and it's complex, but it is doable with the right amount of data, with the right people in place, with the right country involvement, etc. And well, oh yeah, and the last thing I wanted to say that I think collaboration is key there, because there are already great initiatives going on. The Green Economy Tracker, for example, is a great example. They track financial flows already. They have an amazing website also, and that they can play a key role in tracking financial flows for the GBF. So there, that kind of collaboration with the ongoing tracking is, I think, key to make this a success.
Great, thank you. Okay, let's take some questions for from the audience now regarding the landscape of what we've been discussing. If anyone would like to put the hand up or dare to put the hand up, I'm just going to refresh people on the discussion we've had so far. We've talked about indicators being a key outcome here. We've talked about how they are neutral and shouldn't be politicized in and of themselves, but and they need to be, or they can drive communications, or communications of them can drive further implementation as well. We've talked a lot about implementation too. We've talked a fair bit about different sources of information, looking to different organizations that are tracking already, tapping into the business community and the wealth of information too. Any questions for the panel? Please go ahead.
Hi, my name is Kamal. I'm the Global Palm Oil Lead for WWF. We found out in the last few days that the deforestation conversion-free agenda on the framework is not going as well as we had expected. Now, in the situation that is not really covered in the framework, how do you suggest the monitoring and implementation of a DCF agenda in the framework outside of the framework? And the European legislation that was finalized last week is very clear on deforestation not entering Europe. So how could we use that momentum outside the GBF to still monitor traceability and DCF?
Tough question. Would anyone like to take that one?
I'll jump in while you'll give you a bit of time. So I think the main thing for me, and I've said this a couple of times in other sessions actually, is that whatever we come up with from the Global Biodiversity Framework here, this is the first time, for example, that business has been in. 90% of the businesses here have never been to a COP before. They didn't even know it existed. But we've got probably almost 1,000 businesses coming to this one. The work you've just talked about in Europe at the moment, they've already said quite clearly in the negotiations I've been in with them that they're going to move ahead with this no matter what comes out of the Global Biodiversity Framework. So I think the only thing I can say is that even if we don't get all that we want on the piece of paper at the end of this week. The momentum we're building is really significant. One of the things I learned from the climate COP was that a lot of the things like nature-based solutions and the agriculture work that got in this time round were the things we were talking about the last time. Now, we don't have time to wait for the next COP, but there is a good sign that the momentum we've got here, I do have hope that we're going to still keep on pushing it forward. And we've got great examples like in Europe, like you said.
Okay, so I'm not familiar with the deforestation targets myself, so I'll talk in a general sense. And that really just follows what Mark said. I think whatever's agreed here doesn't need to include everything. You know, I think the global biodiversity targets need to show an intention towards halting biodiversity loss, but it's not going to be possible, I don't think, to include every single thing that we want to see in this framework. And there is a need, of course, to measure and ratchet up action according to the information that's provided through indicators on various issues. But since I don't know those specific targets, I'll make a general point. It's my personal view. The role of UN agencies, etc., will be to provide information on the agreed metrics for the post-2020 framework. That's our role. But I've long thought that because we're constrained by that, there is a clear role for other platforms and tools and metrics that could be collated through something like a nature action tracker or other ways of doing this that highlight the challenges that you're describing that may not be covered within the post-2020 framework, that would then allow alerts to governments to see what the issues might be that are not covered. And then when we come to address implementation through Substa and other political means, other scientific and political means, there's an opportunity to then draw upon that information and think, well, actually, are we on the right track and do we need to make adjustments? And there will be a possibility to do that at the national scale.
Barbara?
Yeah, and to add to that, although the discussions here and the public attention is accumulating around the GBF, the COP will decide here on a few other issues alongside. And some of these decisions have already been far advanced here in a positive way, and I'll have two examples for that. One is the topic of biodiversity and health, where there is work going on an action plan. Then there is a topic on the long-term action plan for mainstreaming, and also a whole topic around biodiversity and climate change. And these are topics which have been brought forward in other decisions, which are much more detailed, which have much more content in the sense they are much more detailed and cover the diverse elements which are important to tackle these topics. So let's not forget about this, and there will be follow-up discussions, as Natasha rightly said, at Substa, at SBI, and then at the next COP as well. So there is alongside a long programs of work and planning and work going on also on the COP level outside the GBF. So just to remind us on that.
Thanks, Barbara. Any final questions before we wrap it up?
Hi, Monja from ISO from Geneva. I have a question around standards and how they can support the tracking in the future, and what we have a committee on biodiversity and how to bring that into that committee as well.
Any takers?
It seems like, and you're next. Now, I'm not qualified specifically for your question, but maybe to say, building on the previous comments, and saying this as a former UN staff member, but now working for a science network, science has to be part of this, and any scientific institution that has research and that has evidence that's related to that agenda needs to be involved. And so it is about merging or converging the kind of science perspective with the political processes. This is how we achieve progress. There's no other way to doing this. And we always talk about this kind of science policy interface. This is not kind of a yes or no binary thing. It's about going forward in a way as open and as much dedicated to bringing the science in and to make sure that the monitoring, the tracking happens on the basis of scientific evidence. Because, you know, as other people have pointed out, there's no fooling nature, just there's no fooling climate. We cannot fool into we're taking action when we're not taking action. And so there needs to be ways, and I'm very happy to hear from UN colleagues and others to hear that there is an openness and there is an acknowledgement that there are different roles, but there must be collaboration and there must be this process of converging.
Thanks. Anybody else want to tackle this question? No, we're good. Well covered, Cecil. Thank you. Question over here.
Hi, it's Katie from Nature Metrics. Thanks for giving a shout out to eDNA earlier. That's what we do. First of all, I was just going to give a little shout out to the Scottish Government, who we're working with at the moment, and we've been working with for the last 18 months on looking at how eDNA can help to report on national biodiversity targets. So we've got a report coming out based on a lot of sampling and stuff we're doing in March, so watch this space for that. But, and sorry if this was covered earlier, because I didn't quite get to the start, but we talked a little bit yesterday about how we sort of match the nature positive rally cry with the fact that, you know, you can't be nature positive over a time scale that most businesses are really interested in, you know, like the clients we're working with who are making commitments to nature positive, you know, this might be a 30-year thing that we're monitoring at a mine site or something like that. So how do we, like with net zero, people have sort of been now able to sort of be much more specific about whether they're on that pathway or not. And so how do we merge the sort of rally cry and the excitement about nature positive with what we can sort of, what businesses can claim in the meantime?
Great, thanks. Great question, hot topic. Would anybody like to take that one? Too polite.
Yeah. I've long been grappling with this issue because many of the targets that we're talking about might have a longer time frame than 10 years. You know, in order to see the results of, I'm coming from a species perspective, but the results of action, conservation action for a particular species can take years to show a trend in the Red List Index, for example. So I think we need just to be mindful of that. But I think that for Target 15 in particular, and working with the Science Based Targets Network and TNFD, we can see that there's so much more monitoring that can be done outside of the post-2020 framework that can show a positive trend at, for example, at site level, as you're describing, at local level and at national level, that can be communicated, perhaps outside of the monitoring system that we're discussing here, that can give businesses hope and also provide information about the necessary amendments to action that they can take, and also governments some support and some help on what can be done at the local scale. So yes, I think there's a mismatch in terms of actions to monitoring in terms of the lag, the time lag that we'll see. But I'm also feeling quite positive about the mechanisms that are being put in place to measure progress at a finer scale.
Thanks,
I think
Mark.
also the, so you may be familiar with the ACT-D bit, so science-based targets, the TNFD, the work that we've done on assessment that's been around for many years now, all of those things actually come together as a package. So when we're talking about the support service, the global support service, we're already doing that in the business sphere to look at that. We're also going to be launching in January next year an integrated protocol, because the next thing we've got to be clear about here is how the climate, nature, and equality all fit together. And the reason why we're no longer called the Natural Capital Coalition is because we realized we were causing as many problems by just looking at nature as we were when we were just looking at finance. Because the unintended consequences when you just look at nature for people and other things don't work. That's why we became the Capitals Coalition and started looking across all of these issues. And actually at the moment there isn't an integrated framework, there isn't an integrated conference of the parties for all of these things, but we have to start thinking of that as well within all of this. We're making it even more complex now, aren't we? But we can do it, we can deal with complexity. Humans are brilliant at dealing with complexity.
Thanks, Mark. Barbara, last word from you.
Yeah, and again, on when we choose what we use for the monitoring, there are for sure indicators where you get precise data every year, and where the indicator is such, or the measurings you're using is adapting very quickly to what is on the ground. And the REDIX indicator, REDIX index is one which changes very slowly because it's not sort of been updated every year. So when looking in what you choose to measure your things, and here I put my practical footwear on again, is that choose and look for an indicator where you either easily get, it's not choose the indicator where get you the easiest data, that's not it, but make sure what you want to measure. Sometimes the outcomes are just visible later, but sometimes the indicator is only measuring something which is 10 years back, and there is some additional time lags in there. So just be aware of that in a very pragmatic way.
Great, thanks, Barbara. Cecil, quickly.
Just very quickly, a practical example. I think from talking to experts in countries, a core issue and very common one is the insufficient funding of enforcement agencies on the ground, so to make sure that the existing policies are actually enforced. And that's kind of both money and people. Now, if that is such an important piece of the puzzle in countries, how come that when we do global monitoring, that one is not included? And just to say, this is why policy tracking is meant to be complementary to the monitoring of indicators, to really see what are the practical steps in country that are taken with regard to the resourcing of key institutions to make the policies be valid and functional.
Great, thanks, Cecil. And unfortunately, we're out of time now. So just a quick wrap up. We've covered a lot of ground here. We've dealt with some really tricky issues. We're barely scratching the surface on lag times, temporal lags between actions and outcomes, indicators that work, capacity, is tracking for as a support mechanism or as a monitoring mechanism. It can be all of these things. This is going to be a growing space in the next years if we're to be serious about seeing full implementation nationally, and there's going to be a corollary in the private sector space as well, and there's a whole lot more movement happening there too, and these do need to fit together. That all starts with agreement here around a set of action targets in the Global Biodiversity Framework, a set of indicators that everyone can get behind and use for some comparability. So we do urge everybody in the audience here to reach out to parties, to encourage, to ensure that we get brackets removed, that we get the specificity we need coming out of here, that we can see a very different course for nature over the next decade and for the many decades to come. With that, I'd really like to thank our esteemed panel here for their thoughts, their perspective, for the preparation they've done, and for you in the audience for listening as well. So please give a round of applause to everybody on the panel. Thank you very much.